Welcome today. We're so glad that you could join us. My name is Angela Rapp-Kennedy. I'm the Vice President of Systems Transformation here at CQL. And as most of you know, CQL has been working for over 50 years now to make our vision of a world of dignity, opportunity, and community for all people a reality. So we're pleased to be able to continue to use the personal outcome measures as a way to define, measure, improve personal quality of life. And that's really the intent of this personal outcome measures decision-making space that we've been for the last several months. It really helps us all to continue to hone skills so that we can be as reliable and consistent in our application of the POM tool as possible. So Michael and Lynn have a great presentation planned for us today. And if we have time at the end of the webinar, we'll take questions. And of course, if you have questions at any time, you're always welcome to reach out to CQL. So I'll turn it over to Michael and Leanne.
We hope that you get a lot out of this. You'll have our information at the end to contact us. So a little of what we're going to cover today on the overview slide is obviously we'll have an introduction. We're going to define due process, talk a little bit about key concepts and discovery as we're talking to people, and then of course decision making, some tips for success, and finally how this outcome bridges to the outcome of respect. So a little bit of an introduction. As you were probably in attendance, our last webinar was about rights. Today we're talking about people are treated fairly because the two are like this. You cannot have rights, or you have a lot of violations when people are not treated fairly. So we want these to be hand in hand. In your manual that we will be referring throughout this, we are on page 34. This is in the My Human Security Factor, and it is indicator number 6. So what we'd like to start with is to hear from you in the chat, in the Q&A. What does being treated fairly mean to you? And so if you would like to drop an answer to that in the question and answer spot, we will come back to it at the end of this section so that we can hear from you. What does being treated fairly mean to you? So what we want to talk, when we're talking about people are treated fairly, we need to we want to set some basics. Okay, what is fair treatment? Fair treatment is the same rights for all people, whether they have disabilities or not. Okay. Second, due process. If there are rights restrictions, there is due process involved in that. We're going to talk about advocacy and how we as professionals need to advocate for the people who we support to exercise their rights and therefore be treated fairly. We're also going to talk about informed consent. How can, if I have a restriction and I don't understand why, I don't understand what it means, I don't understand that I can change my mind at any time, even though I agreed to the restriction, then that is not being treated fairly. Okay. Presumed competence. One of the great things that is happening now with the new settings rules, with the movement that our systems are going through right now, is that it's more and more important to presume that the people we work with can do things, can do what they want, instead of coming from a position that they have to prove to us that they're competent. We as a system, we as professionals need to be going in with that assumption, with the safeguards necessary, until we learn otherwise. Everything that we talk about at CQL has an individualized approach and treated fairly. People are treated fairly, has the same expectation. Okay, just because one person has a restriction, everybody in the house does not have that restriction. But we also want to make sure that we are teaching people the responsibilities that go with rights, the responsibilities that go with what the choices that we make in our lives. And that brings us to choice. We are providing people with choices. If you've heard it once, you've heard it 1,000 times. A choice between two things is a dilemma. And so this leads right into the next CQL concept that we love, and that is the 3 E's: education, experience, and exposure. As we are talking about fair treatment and what it includes, the same rights, the responsibilities, presumed competence. When we talk about that, we have got to start with education, because we talk about people being treated fairly and what that means when we serve people who don't know what being treated fairly means. If you've been treated unfairly your entire life, then how do you know what it looks like? For example, if you were never taken out on family trips when you were a kid, or you had to stay home because we didn't have a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Now you're in SILA, you don't understand, or now you're in a group home, you don't understand that that is a right, that you're not being treated fairly because you're being treated differently than everybody else. But if that's always the way, if that's always what you have experienced, then you have nothing to judge by. And so a big part of treated fairly and rights is that we have got to educate the people who we support on what treated fairly looks like. We also have to offer those experiences, and maybe those experiences include explanations of what is treated fairly. A lot of times in talking about this, I'll say we have got to learn to say yes. Okay, yes should be the default. Yes, and how are we going to do this should be the default, so that we can offer people the experience that they need. Because once people have experienced fair treatment, they can recognize when they're not being treated fairly. And that goes the same with exposure. These are not passive things that we are doing, that when someone comes to us and says, which never in my experience has it happened, but if somebody comes to us and says, could you explain to me what fair treatment is, that doesn't happen. We are talking about a proactive environment, that so that people can understand what is informed choice. Okay, we're informing you of everything that can happen as we're talking about any sort of restrictions in the home. A lot of times we'll hear there are alarms on the door for one person, and and the people who live there are like, yeah, we know Joe needs that. And yeah, we know Joe needs that is fine, as long as people have been educated in the fact that they do have a choice to say, well, no, I don't want an alarm to go off. And then we as a system have to come back and say, how is this going to be fair for the other 6 guys in the house? And that goes with experience, education, and exposure. Okay. If you have a restriction, rights, or if the outcome is not if there is no informed choice in any restrictions, then the outcome is not present. It's as simple as that. When we talk about when we're talking about people are treated fairly and we're working with our rights list, automatic, not present. So let's see what you guys said. Or nope, not yet. Sorry, I'm looking at 15 different screens here. All right, tomorrow is tomorrow is Human Rights Day, okay? And we wanted to talk about the Declaration of Human Rights because this includes people with disabilities. Tomorrow is the day in 1948 where the UN created this declaration, and it includes personal freedoms, personal security, and some of this may sound a little bit like the personal outcome measures: freedom from slavery and servitude, freedom of movement in your home and community, the right to marry and have relationships, the right to own and not be deprived of your personal property, freedom of opinions and ideas, the right to work and be employed. Think about the people who we support and whether that's true in their lives. And if you're with an organization and you're thinking, well, yeah, that's true. Is it true in everyone's life? Can you go person by person? Is someone's closet locked because they like to take their clothes out of the closet? That's their own property. Is someone's CDs kept up in a closet somewhere for whatever reason? There was one time there was no storage room in his room. That's personal property. Okay, these are the things that we are talking about. So now we're going to hear from you.
Okay, we have a good group here, Leanne. We have a number of responses, so I'm going to read a few of them for us. Sarah says being treated fairly means everyone has the same opportunities despite disability or not. Martina said not being discriminated against. Paula said when I am given choices, I feel I am being treated fairly. Jessica said treated without judgment or criticism. Lisa said being treated equal to others and having my voice heard. And I'm going to do one more here. Megan said being treated fairly means that I am able to exercise the rights important to me without restriction. And if there is a restriction, I am afforded proper due process.
Outstanding. Yay, we could probably end right now, but we have a lot more.
All
okay,
right,
Mike.
thanks, everybody. Okay, so next up, so as Megan mentioned, due process. So what is due process all about, and how do we apply due process in our service settings? So we have the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition here. Just to kind of define it, some of the key ideas to due process. It is a process, just as the name implies, and really organizations should have policies and procedures describing how this process works and how it's implemented. Okay, and most significantly, nobody's rights should ever be taken away without appropriate due process. Okay, so those are the main ideas. Now, let's talk a little bit about that. Why are organizations limiting people's rights in the first place? So once again, we'll get you to use your Q&A, your question box. If you could tell us a little bit about your perspective, why do organizations limit people's rights to begin with? So what is the function of rights limitations? Okay, we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. Okay, so due process. Oftentimes when organizations need to limit or modify people's rights, due process is going to be provided through a human rights committee proceeding. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the best practices for human rights committees. So those best practices include, before any rights are limited, the Human Rights Committee meets to assess the fairness of that limitation, and it should be reviewed on an ongoing basis thereafter. Committees should be constructed in a way that ensures impartiality. Okay, and anytime a right is being modified or limited, people should play a role in the process and should have the opportunity to be represented. Okay, so some other ideas here when we're thinking about rights restrictions. There's certain things that we need to consider if we're going to be restricting somebody's rights, and again, we're going to talk about the function of that in a minute, but prior to restricting those rights, we really need to consider some of the following. Okay, so first and foremost, remember, all behavior is communication. Okay, what is the person trying to communicate to us? All right, we need to understand that before we can take people's rights away. Okay, so what is the person trying to communicate, and can we support that person to find alternative methods to communicate? Okay, any modification of rights should be based on a specific, assessed, documented individual need. So we can't have blanket or arbitrary restrictions. As Leanne mentioned, we can't do this for entire groups of people. It has to be individualized. Okay, and it should be proportionate to whatever that assessed need is. So for example, if a person, if there is a specific assessed need to address a person using the internet in a way that puts themselves or others at risk, the proportionate response to that would probably not be taking away the entire internet. Okay, we don't need to take away their Netflix too. All right, so we need to look at less restrictive measures in order to address that specific assessed need. Okay, so, and we really need to present options to the person, and that includes alternatives to the rights restrictions. So what are the alternatives to the particular setting that the person is in? What are the possible consequences if a rights restriction is not implemented? Okay, so again, back to the 3 E's, informed choice, we should be presenting options. All right, now building on that last point, people should have the opportunity to provide that informed consent. So remember the 3 E's. Information is a critical component to that informed consent, and we shouldn't be taking anybody's rights away without that informed consent. Okay, all restrictions should be temporary in nature, and again, we need to review those restrictions on an ongoing basis. And the goal should always be to restore that person's rights, to give that person their rights back. Okay. And finally, we need to have effective safeguards in place to ensure that the restriction does not do harm to the person or to others that are using that same environment. Okay. All right, so let's come back to the discussion here. Leanne?
And they did not disappoint.
Okay.
I bet if I put it in the chat or ask the question, who can guess what the #1 reasons were? Safety and health. Those are the #1 answers as to why. Now, we also had a couple people who said people like control of other people and maybe some convenience in there. But the vast majority was because we want to keep people safe and healthy.
Okay, thanks everybody for your responses. Yeah, we don't think that you're taking people's rights away because you're mean. We do understand that there's often a function, and oftentimes that is going to be health and safety, but just keep those suggestions in mind. Now, we could devote this entire webinar, or probably an entire series of webinars, talking about human rights committees and due process. The good news is we already have a webinar on human rights committees, so we would encourage you to check that out. We have a lot of other great webinars on our website as well, so check those out. They're all archived and free to view. So we'll refer you to that, and also probably one of the best known resources on human rights committees is the book by Baker and Tabor on human rights committees. So I encourage you to check that out as well.
Okay, we want to talk now about some key concepts and issues around the people are treated fairly factor. And these are things that come up as we're out doing interviews and teaching people to use the POM tool. So the first key issue is perceived and real fair treatment issues. This is it says, one issue may not mean that someone is not treated fairly, but one issue might mean that someone's not treated fairly. Okay, so let's think about some of the examples that or some things that I've seen or that you've seen. You can put them in the question and answer box. But when we talk about treating people fairly, we can talk a lot about food and what happens. And there's a couple of times, more than a couple. Does your organization have a policy that staff can bring in outside food to eat for dinner? Are they bringing in McDonald's while everybody else is having frozen fish sticks, or even everybody else is having I don't know, like tuna casserole, but McDonald's is better than that, or in a lot of people's minds? Would you go to somebody else's house and bring your own food if they could not go out and get their own food? That's not fair. If someone doesn't feel good and they have to go to work, they have to go to day program, that's not fair. What if somebody can't control the heat or the air conditioning in their own home? That's not fair, or even in their own room. I met with one woman who was cold all the time, and silly me was like, well, why don't we get her a heated blanket or a space heater? And the residential manager almost fell over. But we need to think of something other than too bad, I'm sorry. Or what about snacks? Okay, telling an adult you can't have a snack when you get home from work, that's not fair. Telling an adult you can't have whatever snack you want when you get home, that's not fair. Okay, the choice One of the things to look at is who at your organization is controlling this environment. If we go back to organizational situations, have you ever well, not now, but before COVID, have you ever gone to Walmart or Target and you see the big agency van in the parking spot full of people with disabilities while a staff member runs in to buy their hygiene products? Okay, that's not fair. People like to go in to Walmart. One time I saw this and I looked, and the staff who was with them, who was staying in the car with them, was eating Long John Silver's, which is a fish place. And I said to the guys who were all like, "Hey, Leanne," I said, "Oh, did you guys go to Long John Silver's?" And they're like, "No, we just went there so she could get her lunch." That's not fair. Okay, these are the kinds of things that we want to be looking at when we think that that's not fair. We wouldn't go through a drive-through with our kids and buy ourselves lunch and nothing for them. Okay, and this is their vehicle, their agency vehicle. And I don't know about anybody else, but if you've ever had McDonald's fries in your car, you know that you had McDonald's fries in your car for about 3 weeks after that. And so just imagine what it was like for those men for 3 weeks and knowing that they couldn't have that. Okay, next up we have treated fairly and representative payee. CQL is passionate about this, and I want you to know why. With representative payee, what happens is when someone with a disability turns 18, mom or dad, we'll just use mom for now, mom goes to the family doctor and says, "Junior's turning 18. I'm applying for Social Security for him. He needs a rep payee. It's going to be me. Sign this." Okay, there's no talk of whether or not this person wants a rep payee, needs a rep payee for the whole thing. It's not time limited, and there's no oversight. Okay, so we fast forward. Junior doesn't even know that this money is there. Fast forward to when Junior is 28 and his family starts looking for residential placement for him, finally gets someplace and he's going to move in, and mom signs the representative payee over to the organization. Junior still has no idea that that money is floating up there. No due process. Now, I don't know about anybody else. I could have used a rep payee when I was 18. Okay. I had no, I can't be overdrawn. I still have checks left. That was, that was my motto. Mom, can you bail me out? But you know what? I had learned by the time I was 30, maybe, some people would probably debate whether or not I still need a rep payee. But I say I don't. And that's what we are asking for in this. That's what we are requiring in this, is that this is reviewed. That just because somebody has a rep payee when they're 18 doesn't mean they still need one when they're 48. Okay, and so what we require is that we review this just like we review any other rights restriction. Okay, imagine not just not knowing you have the money, but you have no access to that money. Fine. Next thing we talk about is guardianship. Who decided that the person needed a guardian? Many times in the school systems, they are telling parents, be sure to get guardianship, be sure to get guardianship, be sure to get guardianship. Maybe they need to get guardianship, but maybe they don't need full guardianship. Maybe they don't need to strip the person completely of their civil rights. Okay. We also want to look at, why does the person have a guardian? Why do they need a guardian? Some states review guardianship just like we want to review rep payee. The next thing, are there house rules? A lot of times when I am talking about residential, I'll ask house managers, would you want to live where you work? Okay. Or do you have house rules? Is there a bedtime at your house? Does everybody have a bedtime? Does everybody take their meds at the same time? Everybody get up at the same time? Have their showers at the same time? And we have this regimented schedule that, what if it doesn't work for Jim? Okay. What if Jim wants to stay up until 11 o'clock and Fred wants to go to bed at 8? Okay. Do you have rules about where you can eat? Where, oh, you're not allowed to eat in your room. I can eat anywhere I want in my house. It's my house. And the people who we support, their money pays for their house. Okay. It's their Social Security that they don't know about that's helping to pay for their house. Okay. Next, when we're talking about treated fairly, what about involuntary placement? What about folks who've moved in who had no choice in where they were moving? Mom and dad made the decision of where they were going to move, when they were going to move, who they were going to move in with. There are people who need mom and dad and like total life support. But I bet that you can think of some people who don't, and who didn't have that, who did not have the opportunity to look at other places, to make a fair assessment of where they were going to live. Okay. What about wages? Okay. People are treated fairly. When we're talking about fair wages, we're talking about no sub-minimum wage, no piece rate. It is, it's being phased out in a lot of states. It's being phased out. There's legislation pending at the federal level. But really think about it, and think about how different our lives would be if we got paid, let's be generous, 23 cents for every progress note that we wrote. Okay. And that's it. We get paid by the piece of paper that we push. That's not fair, because we're at work from 8 to 5. What if I don't, what if I'm waiting for somebody? What if I'm waiting for somebody to give me something, so then I can't do the work that I want to do because I'm waiting for somebody else? And how often does this happen? When we're talking about sub-minimum wage, or there's downtime, or there's no work. Okay, that's not treated fairly. We also have, as you guys said, limitations due to safety risk. And we have our young man here wrapped in bubble wrap, because isn't that what we would love to do, to keep people safe and healthy? But what about the dignity of risk? What about the dignity of risk that people with disabilities deserve in their lives? I had a man say to me, I don't know why they're so worried about keeping me healthy when I don't have a life. Okay, if we're wrapping people in bubble wrap, they don't have lives, so what's the point? And finally, what about people not being treated fairly by outside entities? We have wedding rings up here because the first thing that popped into our minds is the marriage penalty. 2 people with disabilities who have SSI cannot get married, or they lose some of their benefits. Okay, that's not treated fairly. So these are some of the things that we are talking about in addition to, it's not just about rep pay. These are some of the things we're talking about too.
Okay, thank you, Leanne. So now we want to explore how we discover. So in interviewing, using our personal outcome measures, how do we find out about fair treatment from people? Okay. So we really just kind of want to step back here and think about where this conversation really begins. Now, Leanne mentioned earlier that people are treated fairly and people exercise rights are intertwined. So where does this conversation really begin? Okay, we really want to, as much as possible, allow the person to take the lead in this conversation. And at this point in that conversation, we might already have some information that we can build upon, such as something that the person told us in the area of rights. We might have made an observation in the person's environment or through their body language. So we might have some information that we can build on to bridge into this conversation. Now, speaking of observations, when it comes to people are treated fairly, what might we be able to observe in this area that might help us to determine whether or not an outcome is present? Okay, so once again, question box, let us know what you might be able to observe to try to learn about this outcome. Okay, so we'll come back to this slide in just a couple of minutes here. Now, in terms of discovery, we really want to, first of all, direct you to your book as well. We're always saying, use your darn book. So in this case, it is on page 33. If you'd like to follow along, the manual offers suggested questions for the person and for those who know the person well. Now, remember, the questions in the manual, these are the types of questions that you should be asking. They're not always the questions that you should be asking, okay? This is not intended to be a script, all right? We want to make this a conversation. And really what you want to try to do is make your questions individualized, all right? So based on the observations you made or something else that the person told you, you might need to ask follow-up questions or ask for more information about that. But you should always consider the person's unique individual circumstances when you are formulating your questions, okay? But the book is a good guide. And as with all of the personal outcome measures, your questions should be open-ended, okay? People exercise rights and people are treated fairly are distinct, but some of the information you collect in one or the other may help you in each of those areas, okay? So some tips for success here in terms of developing good questions. Explore how the person exercises their rights, okay? Explore how the person's rights might be limited. And if you observe or if you find out that their rights are limited, you're going to want to find out, was there due process? Was the person involved? And what is the person's perspective on that rights limitation, okay? You'll need that information in order to decide whether or not the outcome is present. Okay, does the person know how to access the organization's complaint and grievance process? Is that process effective? Are people's concerns being heard? All right, and finally, I'd really encourage you to focus on day-to-day rights issues, including those that we talked about before. You know, and some of sometimes the best way to get to those issues is by asking questions like, who chooses, who decides, who do you have to ask if? So again, day to day, right? Who chooses what time you wake up? Who chooses your shampoo? So Leanne's example of the staff members going into the Walmart to buy the hygiene supplies, it's not fair. So again, day to day, who decides what you spend your money on? Who do you have to ask if you want to use the phone, you want to use the computer, you want to call somebody? Who opens your mail? Okay, so who chooses, who decides? Those are always going to be good questions. Okay, so more tips for success. Remember, what we're really trying to do here is understand the person's definition of this outcome and whether or not their situation matches that definition. So people are treated fairly, but with all 21 of the outcomes, we need to understand how the person defines it and whether their current situation matches. Okay, so when we do find out about rights limitations, we are going to want to ask more questions, right? We should be asking why that rights limitation is in place and what the person's perspective is. What information and support did the person receive to make a choice about that rights limitation? What was the person's role in due process proceedings? And if this is one time where we might want to look at some documentation as well. If there was due process proceedings, with the person's permission, we may want to request some documentation about that due process proceeding to see if the person was involved and to the extent to which they were involved. Okay, what less restrictive measures might have been tried previously? And finally, what is the plan to restore that right? So kind of going back to our list that we talked about earlier, those are all questions that we're going to ask if we do identify a rights restriction. Okay, so now let's see what you all said. What are some things that we might be able to observe?
Well, some people echoed what you said. Do people have to ask? Are they asking staff before making any decisions? Can they move freely within and out? Do staff have keys and the people who live there don't? Are they making choices? Are cabinets locked? These are all great things that we can observe even before starting the interview. Can they get their own objects? Did they decorate their room?
Great examples.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, and finally, this slide is intentionally repeated. Again, we're going to want to explore education, experience, and exposure. Did the person have this? Okay, so we intentionally repeat that for a reason because it is critical.
Okay, we're going to talk about decision making now. And if I'm going to talk about decision making, then what I have with me is my book. Okay, you can do this for 40 years and you still need the book. And I'm probably going to say that about 50 more times before we end. The decision-making questions are on page 34. Okay, so as it says on the slide, use the book. And don't forget about the additional considerations at the bottom. Always ask yourself, how do you know? Ask the person. How do you know that this is happening? Opportunity is the default. We don't go in assuming that people are treated fairly because none of this should be done out of assumption. Okay, so as we talk about the first decision-making questions, have fair treatment or rights limitations been identified? 6.1. If the answer to 6.1 is yes, For each rights limitation identified, was adequate due process provided? So what this means is that we go back to rights on page 31. I'm purposely using my book. We go back to rights on page 31 and we go through and say, is the person exercising their right for personal possessions? If the answer to that is yes, then we can go to I'm sorry, I got messed up. I looked at a yes because I'm looking at my book. But anyway, if the answer to that is no, then we look, was adequate due process provided? So if this person has some of their items locked up, then was adequate due process provided, which includes the Human Rights Committee, everything that happens before the Human Rights Committee. Did we do everything that we could do before we restricted that right? Okay, and we do that for each one of these. Did the person exercise their right to vote? If the answer is no, was there due process? Did the person make an informed choice about not to vote? Sorry, Michael, am I bouncing all over the place here? Oops. Sorry. I
just wanted to show them the list.
I was going to say I should stop looking at my book and look at my slide. Okay. But these are the things that we have to look at. For any fair treatment issue, was it addressed so that the person's concerns were resolved to their satisfaction? Only in that case is the outcome present. Okay, we go on to the supports. Then our question, has the organization solicited information about rights violations or fair treatment issues from the person? That means we have to ask. Our system has set it up so that a lot of people go along to get along. It's just not worth the battle. They're not going to, they haven't been educated about what their rights are, so they don't understand when their rights are being restricted or violated. So then we can't just say, do you think people treat you fair? Oh, okay, sure. Have procedures for adequate due process for any identified rights limitation been implemented? And so a lot of these, if we go back to our list of rights, we're talking about fair wages. Do we know how, do people know how to file complaints about services? Do people have access to food? We could talk about that one all day. Are the procedures used by the organization consistent with due process principles? Or are we restricting people's rights without realizing it? Have we not addressed things, so in a pinch people are trying to figure it out on the fly what we're going to do, that ends up as a rights rights limitation? And does the organization respond to the person's fair treatment issues to address any concerns? Okay, next slide. I'm looking at the clock, guys. So also at the bottom of the page in the decision-making questions, we have additional considerations. So if by looking at those at the decision-making questions, sometimes there's a gray area. That's what additional considerations is for. It includes some rights are restricted because of criminal behavior. Okay, that's addressed in here. Commitment, guardianship, those gray areas, because a lot of times we can look at it and say, oh, does the person have the right to fair wages, or are they making sub-minimum wage? No, they do not make fair wages. No, the outcome is not present. It's an opportunity. Okay. Same with supports. Is the organization doing anything about this? Okay. So again, with the 3 E's, that's how we build up to this, to support people to understand what it means to be treated fairly, what their rights are, supporting them to learn additional skills, and active. Not the once a year, oh, they signed a rights statement in 9-point font so we can fit it on one piece of paper. That's not educating someone about their rights. And outcomes are always personally defined. I almost didn't say that because I figure that we know that, but hey. Satisfaction is not the absence of a complaint. Okay, that's the bottom line. And our supports are robust and expanding. Michael, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, active versus passive, we really want to make sure that we're not simply just responding when the person comes to us with a problem. We should have an active process in place to really try to find out information from the person in this area and all of the areas. Okay. Supports should be individualized. Again, organizations do need systems in place. Due process is a system, rights education is a system, but that doesn't automatically make the support present. Okay. A support is not a policy, a procedure, a program, a pamphlet. Although you may have those systems in place, we really need to see how those supports are applied to that individual person based on their own unique circumstances. And that's really what we have to look for in interviewing. We never want to assume that it's there. We need to see how it is applied to that person. Okay. And again, due process. Okay. Organizational procedures and values and supports must be consistent with due process principles. All of the principles we talked about earlier, and there has to be a system in place. This one, we say there's no automatics in personal outcome measures, but this is one of those areas where if there's no system to support this, it virtually is going to be an automatic because we need to have that due process system and we need to be consistent with due process principles always, okay? So, all right, how we doing here? Okay, tips for success. Okay, so some of this is going to be review at this point, but we wanted to give you a few more pointers in this area. So some of the other things that we would encourage you to do, in this case, don't simply ask, are you treated fairly? Okay, first of all, it's kind of a yes/no question. It's not an open question. I've heard it multiple times. Don't ask that question because remember, if the person has been being treated unfairly their entire lives, they're not going to know what fair treatment looks like. So that by asking that question, you're assuming that the person has the proper context in which to make that decision. Okay, so again, go back to the questions that we suggested earlier and make sure that your questions are open-ended. Okay, a lack of information or examples of unfair treatment does not make this outcome present. So our default is that it is an opportunity. And for those of you who didn't know this yet, instead of saying not present, we're saying opportunity because it's a more positive way to say it. It's an opportunity for us to provide additional support. And that's our default, is that it's an opportunity. So the onus really is on the interviewer to prove that an outcome is present through the evidence that you collect. So just because there's a lack of examples, that doesn't automatically mean that it's present. You really have to have the evidence to prove that it is there, okay? And so remember, this outcome looks at a person's entire life. So it's not just services, not just a person's home or their program. Really, we need to evaluate the big picture here. So the person's place in our society, the person's place as a citizen, as an employee, a tenant, a taxpayer, a whole person. Okay, we need to look at the person's entire life. Remember, we're going to say it one more time because it's that important. It cannot be present unless experience, education, and exposure are present. And finally, use your darn book, particularly during decision making. It's critical that you're evaluating those criteria each time you make a decision in this area.
Okay, real quick, we wanted to talk about the bridge to this outcome. From this outcome to respect, we'll be taking a deeper dive into the respect outcome next year. But respect is an overarching outcome, okay? And so if someone's rights are not present, if someone is not being treated fairly, then we look at that when we're thinking about respect. Because if I don't understand what it's like to be treated fairly, if I'm not being treated fairly, if I don't understand my rights, then how is that respectful? And so we're gonna close. We got a couple more slides for you, and then we'll close it out. We have some more references for you. Like I said, we will have upcoming webinars next year. We will be sure to send that information out to you as it becomes available. And we have an e-community on Facebook that is very active. Feel free to join us, get some answers to your questions, and give people ideas. It's a great place to get together with other people who work with CQL. Okay, and finally, this is our contact information. You can send us an email. I did see a couple questions in question and answer. If you could email those questions to us, since they're kind of individualized, we will be happy to answer. And then we wanted to close. Yeah.
Oh, this is Angela. There was one question I thought we've got a couple minutes that was worth you and Michael responding to. And it's the question that's on everyone's mind. So how do we support choices during the pandemic? Community outings could put other people and staff at risk. What are your thoughts about being treated fairly during this pandemic?
It's a good question, and it comes up a lot and certainly has an impact on all of the outcomes, right? It really does. We think about continuity and security in our social roles and our natural supports. And, so remember here, folks, people define their outcomes, and people are treated fairly is no different in that sense. However, one of the things that people that receive supports experience that we may not is limitations that are imposed to them or on them by service providers and service systems. Okay, so where we're all weighing the risk and the benefit of going to the grocery store or going out to eat at a restaurant, we weigh those risks every single day. People that receive supports have this added issue of service systems, states, provinces, governments, service providers imposing restrictions upon them as well. And so that does impact this outcome. So remember, we treat people that receive supports the same as everybody else in our society, and people that receive support should have the same rights as everybody else within our society. And that's not to say that we need to that we don't need to take certain precautions, because we certainly do. But it is a consideration that there is that impact, and people's rights are impacted by some of those restrictions.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, that's great. So we wanted to share our books one more time, because the questions are not the only things in the books. Okay, and it'd be a good idea for you to go through and read your books every once in a while. And so at the beginning of each outcome are the values and principles for organizations. And so we wanted to share that with you about people are treated fairly. So the values, people have the right to be heard, to be informed, and to give consent. People with disabilities have the right to be treated the same as anyone.